The war in Europe was over. But the prisoners still felt proud as they traveled across the Atlantic Ocean. In June 1945, big ships brought thousands of German soldiers to America. They had been caught in France, in a place called the Ruhr Pocket. And even in Italy, now they were being brought to camps in Kansas, Texas, and Iowa. Dust blew around their boots. And their uniforms hung loosely because they hadn't had much food for weeks. But they still acted proud, especially the officers. One afternoon, when they heard the Americans would feed them in something called a cafeteria, they started laughing in their sleeping quarters. A lieutenant from Hamburg made fun of the word, saying it sounded like a cheap restaurant or a place where schoolchildren eat lunch. He said Americans don't know anything about proper dining. Their meals are silly, like their movies, loud, cheap, and with no taste. His friends laughed too, saying that only in Germany did people treat meals like art, keeping their dignity, even during wartime. The strange part was that many of them hadn't eaten a full meal in months. Bread had been hard to find, potatoes were limited, and meat was almost gone. Yet their pride was stronger than their hunger. They remembered fancy officer dining halls with oak wood on the walls, white tablecloths, sausages arranged perfectly, wine bottles opened with ceremony. It wasn't really about the food, but about the show, the sense of rank at the table, too. The Germans eating meant order and discipline, and they thought Americans had none. What they didn't know was that by 1944, the U.S. Army supply system had created something no army in history had ever done before. America could supply not just its soldiers on 3 continents, but also its prisoners. In that single year, American farms grew over 24 billion pounds of meat, and flour mills made more than 120 million barrels of wheat. Entire trains roared across the Midwest, carrying milk, vegetables, and sugar. It wasn't ceremony the Germans would find, but huge amounts of food. Still, the prisoners laughed. Imagine metal cups and watery soup, maybe a slice of dry bread. A young private said he was sure the Americans would make them eat like animals, one pot, one spoon, no dignity. Even hunger couldn't stop their smugness. They believed America was too rough and too bold to understand what a meal should be. And so the scene was ready prisoners making fun of things. Empty with hunger, but wrapped in pride, about to walk into a place that would shake their confidence more than any battlefield loss. For behind those cafeteria doors, under bright electric lights, was not shame, but a surprise that would stay in their memories for decades. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps keep forgotten parts of history alive. And before we continue, share your location and local time in the comments. It reminds us how history connects us across distance and time. The first night, as prisoners passed with the usual mix of tiredness and anger. But when the prisoners woke up, they carried with them a strange pride, based not on winning, but on memory. What they missed most wasn't the battlefield, but the ritual of the German table. In their minds, even the simplest military dining hall in Germany had an air of ceremony. There was order in every action. The officers sat first. The folding of hands before eating. The careful serving of sausages and cabbage. Sometimes even a small amount of wine, if they were lucky. They remembered the sharp sound of boots across shiny floors, the smell of tobacco curling in the air, and the way silence was required until the senior officer picked up his fork. It was more than food. It was rank, discipline, and identity, even in defeat. These men held on to the belief that German meals were sophisticated, a reflection of a culture better than the rough, noisy habits they imagined they would find in America. In the barracks, the conversation went on and on. A captain from Bavaria reminded younger men that Americans think lots of food equals culture. He insisted that Germans, even under bombs, had kept the dignity of dining cloth napkins. When possible, toasts to fallen friends, rules that made the table an extension of the officer ranks. Food in Germany was scarce, but its scarcity made ritual more meaningful to him. The act of eating wasn't just survival. It was a show of pride. The younger prisoners listened, nodding. Some thought of home, of mothers who put out steaming potatoes on chipped plates, of fathers who sliced bread with careful attention. These memories carried a feeling of being better, a belief that Germans had always eaten with more refinement than Americans ever could. The word cafeteria still tasted strange in their mouths. They used it mockingly, as if describing a carnival booth. They couldn't imagine that within hours this pride would fall, that the careful rituals they remembered would crumble before something bigger than proper manners. What they didn't yet understand was that America's strength wasn't in ritual, but in plenty, not in rank, but in scale. For the German POWs, this would be the cruelest twist of memory that the tables they longed for, with their rituals and pride, would suddenly feel small, almost fragile when faced with the bright, roaring, democratic machine of an American cafeteria. And so they waited in line, their stomachs growling, still certain they knew what it meant to dine with dignity, still unaware that the next door they would pass through wasn't just a dining hall, but a mirror, showing the true difference between two worlds. The midday whistle blew across the camp, and the guards called the prisoners to gather. Rows of tired Germans shuffled forward, boots scraping against gravel, the sun blazing overhead. They followed the line, expecting some rough feeding area, maybe a pot of thin stew poured into dented metal cups. Yet as they turned the corner, what waited for them looked nothing like shame. The cafeteria doors swung open, and the POWs froze. Before them stretched a hall, blazing with electric light. Rows of shiny tables gleamed beneath bright bulbs, their surfaces spotless, perfectly arranged. Along one side ran the serving line's stainless steel counters, reflecting the heat rising from big pans of food. Steam curled upward from trays of beef stew and mashed potatoes, while loaves of bread sat stacked higher than any prisoner had seen since the war began. The sight was like a movie, overwhelming, as if set up to shock men who had lived in darkness. Green beans glistened under lamps. Cakes were arranged neatly in rows. Pitchers of milk and coffee stood ready, waiting to be poured. The air itself carried the warmth of roasted meat and baked sugar. For a moment, silence fell among the prisoners. Their arrogance faded under the sheer sensory force of plenty. Young Corporal whispered, This is for prisoners." Another soldier, barely 20, blinked rapidly as though fearing the vision might disappear. Their eyes darted to the guards, half expecting laughter or a trick. But the Americans simply pointed toward the trays, impatient and businesslike, as though this mountain of food was ordinary, nothing special at all. The contrast was devastating. Only months earlier, some of these same men had stood in Berlin's ration lines waiting for a scrap of bread or turnip soup. Now in captivity, they faced more food in a single glance than they had seen in weeks. The shiny trays reflected not just steam, but an image of America itself, industrial might turned into food, power measured in calories and cups of milk. Behind them, a Luftwaffe sergeant clenched his jaw, unwilling to let his men see amazement on his face. But even he faltered as the line moved forward and the clatter of steel trays rang in the air. For in that moment, the proud rituals of German dining, the sausages and wine, the toasts and silence seemed almost old-fashioned, fragile against the scale of this glowing hall. The men stood on the edge of something more than hunger. They stood before a revelation. And as they stepped across the threshold, the first to take hold of a shining American tray, they realized that what they had mocked only hours before was about to strip away the very pride they had carried across the ocean. The line shuffled forward, each step echoing against the spotless tile floor. The guards handed out trays, cold steel in their hands, and pointed toward the counters. What happened next would confuse the Germans more than any weapon they had faced on the battlefield. There was no single pot into which food was dumped, no officer yelling orders. Instead, they saw an orderly flow. Each man walked forward, slid his tray along the rail, and chose a spoonful of potatoes or not, beef stew or chicken, a slice of bread, then butter or jam if he wanted. The rhythm was mechanical, yet strangely fair, a production line of food where each man became his own boss. One prisoner muttered in disbelief, We may choose." The guard simply nodded. Another POW whispered, "Like American soldiers." The idea hit them harder than the smell of roasted meat. Choice was a privilege they had not imagined for prisoners. In the Wehrmacht, rations were handed down without question. Eat what was given. No discussion. Here, in captivity, they were faced with the freedom to decide cornbread or biscuits, carrots or beans, coffee or milk. Some hesitated, as if reaching for too much might reveal a trap. A few looked back nervously at their friends before scooping gravy onto their plates. But as the line moved, hesitation gave way to wonder. Trays filled, steaming and colorful, as though the very idea of hunger had been banished from this place. The irony was brutal. Back home, families in Hamburg and Cologne survived on tiny slices of bread. Children shared watery soup. Yet here, the defeated enemy could select between options, an act so simple that it shook their ideas of being superior. The cafeteria showed something they had not prepared for: plenty, linked with freedom. Each tray was a silent lesson, a demonstration that in America, even prisoners could exercise choice, dignity, and fullness. It was democracy turned into food, a weapon without gunpowder, no less powerful than artillery. As they sat down, forks clattering, the posts glanced at one another with uneasy expressions. Pride and disbelief tangled in their throats. One whispered, "We thought they would shame us." But what is this, if not shame of a different kind? For the first time, the laughter that had filled the barracks was gone. In its place came the quiet confusion of men forced to see freedom not in speeches or flags, but in the steaming haze rising from their own plates. The first bites silenced the room. Forks scraped gently against trays as the men tasted what they had mocked hours earlier. A private from Bremen, who had not tasted meat since the winter of 1944, closed his eyes as stew coated his tongue. Another, unsure of the pale spread called peanut butter, dipped bread into it, grimaced, then smiled as he reached for more. The initial sneers dissolved into hurried chewing, eyes darting to see who would admit it first. Within minutes, the order of the line broke down. Men who had finished their portions rose awkwardly, trays still clutched in their hands, and drifted back toward the counters. The guards looked on with faint amusement as the same Germans who had laughed at American cafeterias returned for seconds. One Luftwaffe officer muttered to his comrade, "In Germany, even civilians starve. Here, even captives eat their fill." His words spread quietly, repeated like a confession across the tables. The atmosphere shifted. The first meal had been shock. The second helping became surrender of pride. A sergeant who once lectured on the refinement of German dining now shoved cornbread into his mouth with boyish hunger. A young private licked frosting from his fingers, whispering that it tasted sweeter than any ration his mother had stretched across a month. In the barracks later that night, men laughed nervously, not at the Americans, but at themselves. How quickly hunger had defeated their arrogance, yet gossip grew as well. Some muttered that the plenty was a trick, that Americans staged this bounty to weaken German resolve. Others claimed that the U.S. wasted food while Europe bled, and that such waste was proof of excess. But for most, the memory of that first cafeteria meal would not fade because it filled not just their stomachs, but their imagination. What they did not know was that U.S. agriculture had reached unprecedented scale. In 1945 alone, American farms produced over 55 billion quarts of milk, and sugar beet fields stretched across the Midwest like oceans of white. The cafeteria was not a performance. It was the result of a system that dwarfed anything in Europe. To the prisoners, every slice of cake and every glass of milk was proof that the war had been lost long before they surrendered. That night in the barracks, the men argued, was America strong because of its weapons or because of its food? Could an empire built on plenty be beaten by one that glorified discipline? A captain stared at the ceiling in silence, unable to answer. And here, dear viewer, is where I ask you directly. If you had been one of those men, stripped of pride and hunger alike, what would have broken you first, the enemy's guns or his food? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because history is not just about armies, it is about the taste that lingers after the battle ends. By the second week, the cafeteria had become routine, but the shock had not faded. Each day, the prisoners filed in, trays clattering, steam rising, choices unfolding. Like a quiet parade of plenty. The arrogance that once wrapped their shoulders like a cloak had thinned, thread by thread, until even the proudest among them stood quietly in line. One Luftwaffe captain, known for his sharp orders and scornful gaze, was spotted slipping back into line for seconds. His men watched in silence, a mixture of relief and discomfort settling in their eyes. Pride was hard to maintain when roast beef, coffee, and cornbread sat waiting only a few steps away. Another officer who had once lectured the barracks on American vulgarity now held his tray close to his chest, balancing 2 slices of pie with care. Nobody mocked him. Hunger had united them more effectively than rank or beliefs. But there was another layer to the cafeteria experience that unsettled them even more. Behind the counters stood not just white American cooks, but African American mess workers and sometimes women in uniform, serving prisoners with matter-of-fact efficiency. For men who had been fed propaganda about racial hierarchy, the moment was shattering. To be handed food respectfully, silently, by someone whom their Reich ideology had condemned as inferior shook them more deeply than they admitted aloud. Whispers spread in the barracks that night. Some muttered shame. Others deflected, claiming it was just America's way. But the silence of the officers told its own story. The cafeteria was not only a place of plenty, but a daily reminder that the world they had believed in order. Ritual superiority was collapsing with every spoonful of stew. Statistics sharpened the humiliation. Each camp cafeteria could serve thousands of meals within an hour. Conveyor belt efficiency matched with industrial might. At Camp Swift in Texas alone, records show that over 20,000 pounds of flour were baked into bread each week. The numbers were staggering, relentless, undeniable. Where Germany struggled to feed its children, America fed its prisoners as if scarcity did not exist. As the trays clattered and the line moved forward, many POWs found themselves lost in thought. What did it mean to be fed so well by an enemy? Was it kindness or control, dressed as mercy? A young corporal admitted in his diary that he feared the food more than the barbed wire because it made him forget his hatred. And so, audience, I pose the question to you. If your captor treated you not with cruelty, but with abundance, would your loyalty to your old beliefs hold firm, or would each meal weaken it, spoonful by spoonful? Share your reflections, because in that question lies the hidden weapon of America's cafeterias. Autumn sunlight slanted across the camp when the cafeteria doors opened once more. By now, the ritual was familiar. The shuffle of boots, the gleam of trays, the rising steam of food. Yet something deeper had shifted. What began as laughter had turned to awe, then to uneasy acceptance. Now it lingered as memory being carved into the very core of men who had once sworn loyalty to the Reich. A gray-haired officer, once a veteran of the Eastern Front, sat quietly at a corner table. He held his tray as though it were a treasure. Before him lay mashed potatoes, green beans, and a slice of chocolate cake. He ate slowly, almost reverently, as if each bite carried the weight of a lesson he could not escape. Later in the barracks, he whispered to a comrade, "They win not only with guns, but with their ability to feed even us." We were wrong to laugh. The cafeteria had become a symbol, a theater of plenty, its very mechanic steel trays sliding. Across rails, milk jugs clinking, loaves of bread stacked endlessly testified to something greater than taste. It was industrial democracy in motion, a machine built not just to fight, but to nourish. For the Germans, it was impossible to ignore that such power made their once proud rituals of wine and sausages feel like echoes from another century. Stories spread beyond the camp fences. Some prisoners wrote letters home, careful with censorship, hinting that captivity was less brutal than feared. Others remained silent, ashamed that their most haunting memory of war was not gunfire or bombings, but the plenty of an enemy cafeteria. The irony cut deep. The Reich had promised supremacy, but the lesson they carried home was the humiliation of second helpings. Years later, when the war was long past, these memories resurfaced. Old men, now grandfathers, spoke less of battlefields and more of meals. A former soldier told his grandson not of tanks or artillery, but of the day he mocked a cafeteria and then stood in line for seconds. His voice trembled as he described the clatter of trays, the flood of milk, the sweetness of American cornbread. That image, more than the crack of rifles, had revealed the scale of America's true power. And so the story closes not with thunder or fire, but with a quiet, lingering picture, a shining steel tray piled with food under the hard glow of electric light. For the prisoners who once scoffed, it was a weapon stronger than cannons, a lesson carried across oceans and through decades that plenty itself could break the walls of pride more surely than any bomb. History often teaches us through noise, the roar of cannons, the thunder of engines, the shouts of armies in the field. Yet sometimes its deepest lessons come quietly, in the clatter of trays and the steam of food drifting through a hall. The story of German prisoners who once mocked American cafeterias only to stand humbly in line for second helpings reminds us that power is not always expressed in violence. Sometimes it is revealed in the simple ability to nourish, to sustain, to provide without fear of scarcity. For the men who lived it, the cafeteria became a memory sharper than battle. It stripped away layers of pride and revealed how fragile beliefs can be when confronted with ordinary plenty. The Reich had promised them supremacy, discipline, and order, but it could not fill their stomachs. America, with its vast fields and tireless factories, offered something their homeland could not, a vision of plenty so vast it extended even to enemies. In later years, when those prisoners returned home, many carried this contradiction within them. They had been defeated in war, yet fed in captivity. They had laughed at the thought of eating like children, yet found dignity in choosing their own meals. And in the stillness of old age, when memories of war blurred, it was not always the battlefield they spoke of, but the cafeteria. An old soldier once said that he could still hear the sound of trays sliding along the rail decades after the war had ended. To him, it was the echo of a truth he could never forget, that strength is not only measured in weapons, but in the quiet, relentless power of a society able to feed even its foes.